Tonight at 10, Boris Johnson breaks a key manifesto pledge by raising taxes to pay for health and social care. He says the rises are essential to tackle the NHS waiting lists caused by the pandemic. A new tax will pay for changes to social care in England. The Prime Minister says he wants to remove the anxiety of facing huge costs in old age.
Yes, I accept that this breaks a manifesto commitment, which is not something I do lightly, but a global pandemic was in no one's manifesto, Mr. Speaker.
The pretense that the Prime Minister is only here because of the pandemic is not going to wash. He's putting a sticking plaster over gaping wounds which his party inflicted.
We report on the situation faced by one family who say the changes will not be in time for them.
People like Mum, it's too late. She's given everything she's got. So what happens to the people that are in the system that have already gone well beyond that cap now?
We'll be looking in more detail at the policy which will see Britain's tax burden rise to its highest level in 50 years. Also tonight. In Scotland, the First Minister unveils government plans for a national care service and another referendum on independence. In Afghanistan, hundreds of protesters, including many women, take to the streets of the capital as the new Taliban government is announced.
This is the biggest challenge to the Taliban's authority that we've seen so far, and it's not coming from a militia force, it's coming from peaceful protesters, from both women and men.
And in tonight's football, Scotland seal a 1-0 win over Austria in their World Cup qualifying group.
And coming up in the sport on the BBC News Channel, a dream come true as Britain's George Russell joins Mercedes to ride alongside his idol and compatriot Lewis Hamilton next year.
Good evening. Boris Johnson has confirmed his government will break a key manifesto promise by imposing a package of tax increases from next April. The extra revenue will be used to tackle the backlogs in the NHS caused by the pandemic and to reform the system of social care in England. The new health and social care levy will start as an addition to national insurance, payable by employers and workers, before becoming a separate tax in 2023. Now, the new levy is expected to raise some £36 billion over the next 3 years. From April of 2022, national insurance rates will increase by 1.25 percentage points for all working adults in the UK, to be matched by employers. And the tax rate on share dividends will also rise by the same level. It means that in relation to social care, anyone in England with assets of less than £20,000 would have their care costs fully covered from October 23. And those with assets between £20,000 and £100,000 would receive state support, but that would be means tested. And from October 23, no one entering care in England would pay more than £86,000 on personal care during their lifetime. The changes, just to stress, apply to England. There are separate arrangements in Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland, and they will receive more than £2 billion a year in extra health and social care funding. Laura Koonsberg, our political editor, has more details.
Even most of the cabinet were in the dark.
Morning, sir. Happy to be raising taxes and breaking promises?
Until this much-anticipated plan emerged this morning into the bright light. There were some polite objections behind closed doors, but no straying from perfect manners for the cameras.
I'm happy to be a great supporter of Boris Johnson, who is a wonderful Prime Minister.
Even though Boris Johnson's breaking a promise, raising tax to catch up after COVID and pay for social care.
We must now help the NHS to recover, to be able to provide this much-needed care to our constituents and the people we love, and we must provide the funding to do so now. We will also fix the long-term problems of health and social care.
A low-tax party? Well, it's being hiked on millions of workers and business in what will become a specific charge on your pay to raise £36 billion over 3 years.
From next April, we will create a new UK-wide 1.25% health and social care levy on earned income.
He says COVID's the catalyst, even though care was creaking long before.
I will be honest with the House, I accept that this breaks a manifesto commitment, which is not something which is not something I do lightly, but a global pandemic was in no one's manifesto, Mr. Speaker.
The new promise that no one in England will find themselves in Sharon's position.
I've got some food for you here.
Desperately worried she'll have to sell the family home in Stockport, she does her best to look after her mum Jean, who's in the late stages of Alzheimer's. But before too long, she's likely to move into expensive residential care.
It's the hardest thing in the world. When someone doesn't know who you are and you're right in front of them. My mum is ready for a residential home, a care home. I'm not in a financial situation. It's about £1,000 a week. There would be no house money left. To have somewhere to live is what everybody needs. And it's my home and it can get taken away. Just like that. You got a smile for me?
From October 23, there'll be a guarantee, a cap, that no one who starts paying for care from then will pay more than £86,000 over their lifetime. And anyone with between £20,000 and £100,000 of assets will get some help towards the cost. Ministers will push MPs to vote on the deal tomorrow. Labour believes the rise isn't fair, but it's not entirely clear what they'd do instead.
This is a tax rise that breaks a promise that the Prime Minister made at the last election. A tax rise on young people, supermarket workers and nurses. Mr. Speaker, read my lips. The Tories can never again claim to be the party of low tax.
Changes to social care will only take place in England, but it's a UK tax rise and will mean extra money for Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland too.
It will fall hardest on the young and the lowest paid, the two groups who have suffered the worst economic consequences of the pandemic.
Before today, Tory anger was frothing about putting tax up to make these changes. But there wasn't much evidence of that today.
The reform of social care has been ducked for decades because successive governments have put it in the too difficult box.
But
the Conservative way to raise revenue is to lower taxes, not raise them.
Don't doubt, it's a huge day for the trio who insiders have accused of cooking up this massive deal alone.
What is fair about a huge tax rise, Prime Minister, that will overwhelmingly be borne by working people while the expensive properties of wealthy pensioners are protected?
Measures that we're setting out today, we're protecting everybody's assets of up to £100,000. But it's also now the right thing to do, to take reasonable, fair, responsible steps to put the NHS back on its feet.
People who have wages and no assets are the ones who will pay here.
But everybody, Laura, everybody has relatives who can potentially face the costs of care.
Sometimes politics can feel like a game, but how we pay as a country to look after those who desperately need care is anything but. Today's decisions are huge and not without risk, but Boris Johnson's calculation is that this strategy is one that he will win.
Let's go live to Westminster then, and Laura is there for us. We're nearly 2 years into this government, Laura. How significant a moment is this, and what does it tell us about the kind of ambition that Boris Johnson has now?
Well, Huw, it's a big reckoning, it feels like today, almost like a budget. You know, there's no doubt this is a really hefty tax rise that'll be paid by millions of workers and many firms right around the UK, and it will bring billions and billions into Treasury coffers, largely to go on the NHS right round the UK, but to start also keeping that promise to overhaul and improve the creaking system of social care in England. It genuinely is a big moment, and Downing Street sees this as being ambitious and grasping one of the issues that has been so tough for governments to crack in decades gone by. But it is also a risk for Boris Johnson. There's no question about that. There's been bellyaching in his own party and in the opposition, concern about potential unfairness in how the money is being raised. There are still also a lot of question marks over how the changes to social care will really take place and whether or not the NHS will gobble up most of the money in the years to come and whether or not that promise will really be kept after all. But there's another thing that is on Conservative minds too. It's a concern that Boris Johnson, the leader of a traditionally low-tax Conservative party, even after the emergency of the pandemic, might get rather too fond of being a big spender, might be rather too comfortable with a big and bigger state. And even today in his press conference, he wouldn't rule out actually bringing in further tax rises at some point, even though he made clear that it's not really what he would like to do. So this isn't just a big change in terms of policy. It isn't just a big potential change in the experiences that patients in the NHS across the UK and families in England experience when they're trying to find care for their loved ones. It's a big further step along the Conservatives' political journey too. And like all big moments for Prime Ministers, they always know that they are looking at a calculation, the pros and cons of taking a decision one way or another. And in that sense, this is a gamble. Boris Johnson has made the choice to choose an imperfect course of action rather than the risk of doing nothing at all. The real test probably, Huw, won't be in the House of Commons tomorrow, but in the years to come, to see whether the NHS can bounce back from the emergency of the pandemic and whether so many families' agonies over care for their loved ones really fades.
Laura, many thanks again. Laura Kuenssberg there with her thoughts at Westminster. Well, Boris Johnson has stressed that today's measures are aimed at making sure that those in need of social care in older age will no longer face what he called the catastrophic fear of losing everything in order to pay for help. Initially, social care in England will get £5.4 billion over the next 3 years. The money will help the 839,000 people who are currently receiving long-term support, though many more have applied for help. In fact, the charity Age UK estimates that 1.5 million older people are not receiving the care that they really need. Furthermore, the sector is short of staff. There are currently 112,000 vacancies for care workers. Our social affairs correspondent, Alison Holt, reports on the potential impact of today's proposals.
Small jelly deals.
This trip to the Essex coast brings back happy memories for Sharon. It's one of the places she and her mother loved visiting. Now 92-year-old June is in a nursing home. She has heart problems, epilepsy and needs a lot of help, which has been paid for by selling the council house the family worked hard to buy. Their experience underlies why reform of the care system is so desperately needed.
It's just worrying me sick. It's worrying me sick.
1 in 7 people will pay more than £100,000 towards their care.
She does know she hasn't got endless pots of money. You know, we've paid sort of, I think it's my last calculation, about £250,000–260,000 in fees already.
The money will run out within weeks, but council funding doesn't cover the home's fees, so after 4 years, Sharon's mum may be forced to move somewhere cheaper.
I mean, mum's not a piece of luggage that you auction off to the lowest bidder. I made a promise to my mum that she would stay in that home. Obviously, when the promise was made, we didn't realise mum was going to live as long and the financial situation was going to get so dire.
What does care mean to you? It's an independence. Being able to, I'm off again.
For Sherry, support from care worker Nicola is allowing her to remain in her own home.
And know that whoever comes in is here to look after me.
And today's plans promise to raise the fees councils pay for care. To tackle staff shortages, there'll be extra money for training and skills.
Recruitment is really is needed, but sometimes obviously without funding, pay doesn't always reflect the job. And the job is very, very hard, but it's rewarding at the same time.
But whilst more money is welcomed, experts fear it won't be enough to fix the care system's deep-rooted problems.
In terms of the rest of the vision around social care, and particularly the financial support to make sure the social care sector can deliver the amount and quality of care we want, that feels like that's quite missing here, and particularly the level of funding over the next 3 years just feels too low for me when I think about the scale of challenge in social care.
But getting care right for the future is vital for people like 34-year-old Edith, who has multiple sclerosis. More than half of current care spending is on younger adults. She works and wants to make the most of life, but staff shortages mean she struggles to find enough support.
Everyone is one accident or one illness away from needing social care, and you don't realise until you need it how vulnerable the system is. And it's really frightening when you're in it. And that's why we need real reform.
Families, care workers and many more will be placing a lot of hope on today's plans for the care system. Now they need to see whether they will lead to the change that's needed. Alison Holt, BBC News.
Well, for the next 3 years, most of the extra money will go to the NHS. The Department of Health will get around £10 billion a year over the next 3 years. From that, around £6 billion will go to NHS frontline services in England each year. It comes as a record 5.5 million people are now waiting for routine NHS treatment in England. And the Prime Minister warned today it'll get worse before it gets better. Our health editor Huw Pym has more details.
James, who's from Halifax, in happier times. This was his wedding day with his family in 2015. 4 years later, he had a heart infection which damaged a valve. An operation was planned for May last year, but during the pandemic it was cancelled 5 times.
Thank you, Mr Wilkinson, for joining us. Hope you don't mind me calling you James.
It just so happened he was giving evidence to a committee of MPs this morning.
Every day, you sat at home 3 months, I was isolating for. Not hearing anything, not knowing anything, every day feeling worse every week, getting worse and worse with the health and the anxiety.
It would have had a huge emotional experience for yourself.
It's cases like this which have caused mounting concern at Westminster and have led to the government's response for England today. So what do people think of paying more national insurance for the NHS and social care?
I think it's absolutely essential. The sooner we sort all our social problems out, the better.
I would say no, really, but my reasons are that you've had enough already, aren't you, really? So I'd say just no.
I'd happily pay a little extra for someone else to receive the right care.
So will the new money allocated to tackling the backlog of postponed operations be enough?
What we have to remember is...
Health service leaders in England had asked for £10 billion a year extra for the NHS front line, but it'll be just over half that.
So we recognise that it's a significant funding allocation at a time of really constrained public finances, but we do believe that it falls significantly short of what the NHS needs, both for day-to-day running and also to tackle that backlog of care. It's a start, but it doesn't go far enough.
Some of the new funding will be targeted at cutting the backlog, encouraging hospitals to do more operations than before the pandemic. Kingston Hospital's already achieving that by opening up operating theatres for longer. But getting already overstretched staff to do extra hours may be hard to sustain.
Where consultants and nurses are doing extra lists now, I can't see them being able to carry that on ad infinitum. But I do think that they'll be able to do it to give us time then to recruit and plan for the future such that we can then build up the workforce. It's a challenging prospect.
Like most hospitals, it's extremely busy here right now, and what makes planning ahead so difficult is uncertainty over what the winter might bring in terms of COVID and flu. Rising demand for urgent care in the months ahead may yet cause more delays for routine operations, and that could make the task of cutting numbers on the waiting list even harder. Huw Pym, BBC News.
Well, the tax rises outlined today mean that workers and employers will be paying more. But when combined with the rises announced in the budget earlier this year, government income from taxes will reach the highest level in some 40 years. Our economics editor, Faisal Islam, is here with his analysis. Faisal.
Thanks, Hugh. At £12 billion a year, this is the sort of tax rise on pay packets we haven't seen in years. So who pays the bill? You can get a picture here of how all workers above the national insurance threshold pay. They will see it listed on their pay slips from £20,000 a year, about £100 a year in extra contributions, to £100,000 salary, over £1,100 a year. The highest paid pay the most. This, though, is just employees' national insurance. Taking into account roughly £5 billion of employers' national insurance also going up, the tax on pay packets overall is nearly double what we saw before. It could be seen in the form of squeezed wages or higher prices. National insurance will also be applied to earnings from the over 66s to try to address concerns that younger workers are funding older homeowners. Unlike for income tax, national insurance is not levied on savings, property or pension income. For the same reason, the dividend tax paid by shareholders was also increased. These last two will raise relatively modest sums, about £600 million for dividends. The big picture here is that the pandemic has increased how much government taxes, how much it spends, what it does. And that is a permanent change in the size of government, more like what happened after world wars than, say, the financial crisis.
Today, overall, we actually got a fairly big increase in spending for health and social care and a big tax rise to go with it. Taxes now, as a share of national income, are going to be at their highest ever level in the UK. So today, in that sense at least, was a big deal.
There was another manifesto breach. For over a decade, the state pension has been triple locked, guaranteed to go up by the highest of inflation, 2.5%, or earnings. Now, because of furlough, lockdowns and the pandemic, that earnings figure was due to go up by a colossal 8%. So the government has cancelled that for 1 year, making it a double lock, meaning that instead the state pension is likely to rise by 3 to 4%. That saves the government £4 billion in spending at a time when it needs the money. That is a temporary change, though. The changes to levels of tax, spend and the size of government are very much here to stay. Huw.
Faisal, many thanks once again. Faisal Islam there, our economics editor. And just to remind you to find out more about the changes in social care, indeed all the changes announced today, and how the system works in Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland, where there are separate arrangements, go to bbc.co.uk/news and you'll see all the sections there and you can navigate to the different parts. Now, let's have a look at the latest on the state of the pandemic. The impact of the pandemic is the context, of course, for today's announcements. So let's look at the latest official figures then. There were 37,489 new infections recorded in the latest 24-hour period, which means an average of 38,500 cases per day in the past week. Figures also show that there were nearly 8,000 people in hospital being treated for COVID yesterday. 209 deaths were reported in the latest 24-hour period. That's people who died within 28 days of a positive COVID test. And that takes the average number of deaths per day to 135 over the past week. To look at vaccinations, nearly 89% of people in the UK over the age of 16 have had their first jab, and just over 80% have had both doses. The First Minister of Scotland, Nicola Sturgeon, says her government will introduce legislation for a national care service, describing it as the most significant public service reform since the creation of the NHS. Outlining her programme for government, Ms Sturgeon said that funding for social care would increase by 25% over 5 years. She also said that she intended to hold another referendum on independence. Our Scotland correspondent Lorna Gordon has more details.
No pomp and ceremony here, but this walk by the First Minister a familiar image, setting out the Scottish Government's equivalent of the Queen's speech and reaffirming its commitment to a second independence referendum, COVID permitting, before the end of 2023.
The Scottish Government will now restart work on the detailed prospectus that will guide the decision. Presiding Officer, the case for independence is a strong one, and we will present it openly, frankly, and with confidence and ambition.
As well as outlining the commitment to a referendum on independence, the measures give details of increased investment in frontline health services, plans to expand wraparound childcare before and after school. There will also be bills focused on pandemic recovery, one establishing a national care service, another pardoning minors convicted during the 1980s strike, as well as reform to the Gender Recognition Bill. Some of these are controversial, with recent protests outside Parliament, opinion polarised on proposed reforms to gender recognition. The resumption of work on a second referendum will also be the focus of much of the attention. Supporters of independence believe the dial on the debate has shifted with the deal between the Scottish Greens and the SNP. Opponents, though, think this will pull communities apart rather than bringing them together.
Priorities were wrong last week, and they're still wrong this week. Because another independence referendum is front and centre of the First Minister's plans for the year ahead.
Scotland needed a programme for government that recognised the scale of the challenge facing our country. But instead he got a programme that was short on big ideas. This isn't good enough, it isn't bold enough, and it won't do enough.
Some don't have to think about all this just yet, but others out enjoying the weather had views on what were their priorities.
I work in healthcare, so for me that's a priority. You see the effect on COVID in the system that's already struggling.
It would be much better for Scotland to be an independent country. So it's a fairly high priority for me.
I don't think independence should be something that we should be focused on at the moment. I think we've got an economic recovery on our hands.
As the pandemic recedes a little, The debate over Scotland's future begins again. Lorna Gordon, BBC News, Edinburgh.
In Afghanistan, the Taliban have announced an interim government 3 weeks after they took control of most of the country. Today, hundreds of protesters, including many women, took to the streets of the capital, Kabul, chanting slogans against neighbouring Pakistan, whose government they accuse of supporting the Taliban. Our correspondent, Secunda Kamani, with camera journalist Malik Mudassir, have sent this report.
Death to Pakistan, the crowd chant. They're furious at what they believe is the country's support for the Taliban, including, they allege, in taking over Panjshir, the last province to be captured by the group.
Pakistan has directly attacked our country. We don't want Pakistan to announce the government here. Afghanistan is a free country. We women and men are not the same as those 20 years ago who were being whipped into submission.
But Pakistan says the Taliban are Afghan. It's got nothing to do with that.
I accept the Taliban are Afghans, but behind them is Pakistan. They gave them this ideology.
Pakistan says it's always worked for peace in Afghanistan. Taliban members initially appear to allow the protesters to march through the city.
This is the biggest challenge to the Taliban's authority that we've seen so far, and it's not coming from a militia force, it's coming from peaceful protesters, from both women and men.
And amongst the protesters, some not afraid to directly criticise the group.
We demand freedom of speech, democracy, national resistance against the Taliban.
Aren't you afraid?
We are not afraid of death. We are the young generation and will bring the bud of freedom. Our voices will make history.
At a Taliban press conference, the group rejected what they termed propaganda about Pakistan's influence. This evening, they finally announced their new government, naming Mullah Haibatullah Emir or supreme leader of the country, Mullah Hassan Akhund as caretaker prime minister, and Sirajuddin Haqqani, wanted by the FBI, as minister of interior.
There's no women in the cabinet. What message do you think that sends out?
We haven't announced all the ministries and deputies yet, so it's possible this list will be extended.
Back at the protest, convoys of Taliban vehicles made their way to the site. Eventually, fighters fired shots in the air to disperse the crowd. Dissent is not something the Taliban is used to. Secunda Kamani, BBC News, Kabul.
Police Scotland has been fined £100,000 after admitting that failures in its call handling system contributed to the death of a young mother who lay undiscovered in a crashed car with her partner for 3 days. Our Scotland correspondent, Alexandra Mackenzie, has this report.
Lamara Bell was a 25-year-old mother of two. She was returning home with her partner John Ewell when their car left the road. Outside court, Lamara's mum welcomed today's decision.
It's taken a long time for this conviction to be secured, but it is a huge relief that Police Scotland has finally admitted being at fault. Finally, we can say Lamara is justice.
A 101 call was made to police hours after the crash by a local farmer who saw the car. But the court heard that at the time Police Scotland had failed to provide an adequate call handling system. The call was not electronically logged, so no police incident was created. 3 days later, another member of the public saw the car, made a 999 call, and police went to the scene. The court heard that John Ewell was likely to have died at the time of the accident, but Lamara Bell would in all probability have survived if she'd received emergency treatment in the first few hours. The current Chief Constable said the deaths were a tragedy.
The preservation of life and helping people who are in crisis go to the heart of our duty to keep people safe. Police Scotland failed Lamara and John in that duty, and for that I am sorry.
The judge said Lamara Bell died after days of severe physical suffering and must have been in a state of disbelief that no help was coming. Alexandra Mackenzie, BBC News at the High Court in Edinburgh.
Angela Merkel has made what's expected to be her final appearance before parliamentarians in the Bundestag 16 years after becoming Chancellor of Germany. She used her last address to Parliament to attack her coalition partners ahead of elections later this month, warning of the dangers of a left-wing government in Germany. Let's have some football news, and Scotland have edged closer to next year's World Cup with a vital 1-0 win over Austria in Vienna. The result leaves Scotland second in their qualifying group, as Katie Gornall reports.
In Vienna, Scotland were at a crossroads on their World Cup journey. This, they said, was a game they couldn't afford to lose. No one was expecting an easy ride. Just a point separated Scotland and Austria at kick-off, with both teams desperate to land the first blow. Chances flowed and Lyndon Dykes rose. Nothing that time, but in this frantic first half, another opportunity for Scotland wasn't far behind. The referee decided Che Adams had been hauled down, and so Dykes stepped up. This time, he did beat the keeper. After the break, Austria grew increasingly frustrated. The tension rose, the pressure was starting to show. Austria outperformed Scotland at the Euros, but here they looked vulnerable. Stephen O'Donnell nearly took advantage. But still, there was no margin for error, and thankfully for Scotland, they had Craig Gordon to rely on. That save meant Scotland hung on for a vital 3 points and a win that keeps the dream alive. Katie Gornall, BBC News.
That's it. For more on today's events, Newsnight is starting now on BBC Two. Here on One, it's time for the news where you are. Have a good night.